I was Margaret Fields, a celebrated scientist and unapologetic skeptic, the kind of person who believed every question had an answer if you dug deep enough, until the day I died. One moment, I was standing in front of an audience, dismantling the idea of God with precision and logic. The next, I was somewhere else entirely, surrounded by an overwhelming presence that unraveled everything I thought I knew. That moment changed me forever, not because I found answers, but because I was shown truths I never knew to seek. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, a restless energy that I always found both invigorating and irritating. My lectures had a reputation for sparking controversy, and tonight was no exception. As I adjusted the microphone clipped to my blazer, I glanced at the crowd. Some faces were eager, others skeptical, and a few outright hostile. I lived for moments like this, when my words could cut through centuries of dogma and superstition like a scalpel through flesh. Faith, I began, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge, is humanity's oldest coping mechanism. It's an elegant lie we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos. A murmur rippled through the audience. I saw someone in the front row frown, clutching a small crucifix dangling from her neck. Good. A little discomfort meant they were listening. For the next 45 minutes, I laid out my case with the precision of the scientist I prided myself on being. I presented charts and data debunking the so-called miracles attributed to divine intervention, dissected ancient texts to expose inconsistencies, and cited neurological studies showing how the brain can fabricate spiritual experiences under stress. By the time I reached my conclusion, I felt the familiar rush of triumph. But then, during the Q&A, it happened. The last person to stand was a young man, barely out of college judging by his rumpled hoodie and hesitant posture. He clutched a worn Bible in one hand, and his voice trembled as he spoke. Dr. Fields, you're clearly brilliant, and I respect your work, but isn't it possible that science doesn't have all the answers? That faith fills the spaces we can't yet measure? The room went silent, every eye fixed on me. I felt a flicker of irritation. I had heard variations of this question 100 times before, and my answer was always the same. Possible? Sure. But probable? Not in the slightest. I replied, my tone as sharp as the edge of a scalpel. Science isn't about comforting what we don't understand. It's about confronting it. Faith is a crutch, and crutches don't make you stronger. They keep you weak. The young man's face flushed, but he didn't argue further. He sat down, and the moderator quickly moved on to close the session. I gathered my notes, satisfied that I had once again dismantled another flimsy attempt to challenge my worldview. As I walked off the stage, a sharp pain blossomed in my chest, like a fist tightening around my heart. I staggered, clutching the edge of the podium, but the pain only grew worse. My vision blurred, and the room began to tilt. I heard someone shout my name, but it felt distant, like a voice underwater. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, or rather, when I became aware again, it wasn't to the blinding fluorescent lights of a hospital or the frantic murmurs of paramedics. I was somewhere else entirely. The space around me was vast and impossible, stretching endlessly in every direction. It wasn't empty, though. It shimmered with shifting colors and patterns that I couldn't quite focus on. The air, or whatever passed for it, hummed with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. At first, I thought it was a dream. Maybe my brain, deprived of oxygen, was conjuring this strange liminal space as it shut down. But then I noticed the figures. They were indistinct, their forms flickering like old film reels out of sync, but I felt an uncanny familiarity with them. I couldn't see their faces clearly, yet something deep within me knew they weren't strangers. They moved silently, their presence both comforting and unnerving. Hello. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the immensity of the space. The figures didn't respond, but one stepped closer. It was my mother. She had been dead for over 20 years, but there she was, as real and solid as I remembered. Her dark eyes, so often filled with quiet disappointment when we argued about faith, now looked at me with something else entirely. Was it pity? Mom, my voice cracked. What is this? What's happening? She didn't speak, but her expression said everything. She extended a hand, and as I reached for it, the shimmering space around us shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't in a vast, kaleidoscopic void anymore. I was back in the small, cramped apartment where I had grown up. The air smelled of mothballs and overcooked stew, just as it had when I was a child. I looked around, confused. "Why are we here?" I asked. Again, my mother didn't respond. Instead, she gestured to the window, where a scene from my life played out as if projected on a screen. It was me, years ago, dismissing my younger sister when she came to me in tears after our father's funeral. She had begged me to pray with her, to find comfort in faith. I had laughed, told her that prayer wouldn't bring him back, and walked away. The scene shifted. Now I was in the lecture hall of my first teaching job, tearing into a student's poorly written paper with sarcasm and scorn. His face crumpled as he left my office, but I barely noticed at the time. Scene after scene played out, each one highlighting moments I had dismissed as insignificant but now realized were pivotal. Moments where my words or actions had wounded others in ways I had never bothered to consider. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Why are you showing me this?" Finally, my mother spoke. Her voice was soft but carried an authority I had never heard from her in life. "What have you done with the life you were given, Margaret?" I don't understand," I stammered. "I've achieved so much. I've educated thousands of people, advanced our understanding of the universe. Isn't that enough?" Her gaze didn't waver. "You filled your mind, but what about your heart? You've built walls of logic, but at what cost?" I wanted to argue, to tell her that my work mattered, that I had dedicated my life to truth. But deep down, I knew she wasn't asking for a defense. She was asking for honesty. Before I could respond, the space around me began to dissolve, the shimmering colors bleeding into one another. My mother faded, her form dissipating like smoke. The last thing I heard was her voice, softer now, almost a whisper. "It's not too late, Margaret, but the choice is yours." Then there was nothing. When I became aware again, I was back in the shimmering space, the waiting room, as I later came to call it. The kaleidoscopic lights were calmer now, their motion slower, almost meditative. The indistinct figures moved around me, their presence growing heavier, more purposeful. I felt a sense of pressure, as though unseen eyes were fixed on me, weighing me, assessing me. I didn't call out this time. My mother's voice still echoed in my mind, her question a hook buried deep in my thoughts. "What have you done with the life you were given?" It wasn't a reprimand, it was worse. It was an invitation to reflect, to turn over stones I'd long ignored. And I hated it. I tried to move, to walk or run, or even will myself awake, but I was frozen, not paralyzed. Exactly, more like the space itself held me in place. Time, if it existed here, dragged on interminably. It felt like hours, maybe even days, passed as I stood there, helpless and uncertain. Then something shifted. The figures faded into the periphery, and the light around me intensified, narrowing into a beam that enveloped me. The air, if there was air, grew thick and electric. I wasn't afraid, exactly, but I felt exposed, like a spotlight was illuminating every hidden corner of my soul. And then I felt it. It wasn't a voice, not in the way I understood voices, but it was unmistakable. A presence, vast and overwhelming, pressed into me. It wasn't male or female. It wasn't even human. It was everything, every thought, every feeling, every moment of existence rolled into one incomprehensible force. And it wasn't just around me, it was inside me, threading through my consciousness as if it had always been there, waiting. I wanted to speak, to ask what it was or why I was here. But before I could, a flood of images overtook me. I saw my childhood, the moments of wonder and innocence I had buried under years of cynicism. I saw my teenage years, where the seeds of doubt took root, and my anger at the world for its chaos hardened into intellectual pride. I saw myself pushing away people who didn't fit into my worldview, my mother, my sister, my friends. I saw every step that had led me to the person I was now, standing defiantly at the podium, certain of my superiority. And then the images shifted. I saw the lives of others. The young theology student for my lecture, his spirit crushed under my dismissal. A colleague I had humiliated in a meeting, their confidence shattered. My sister, crying alone after I laughed at her faith. These moments unraveled before me, not as abstract memories, but as visceral, immediate experiences. I felt their pain, their anger, their despair. It tore through me like fire, and I couldn't turn away. I tried to justify myself, to cling to the logic that had always been my shield. I didn't know. I didn't mean to hurt them. I was just being honest. But the presence wasn't interested in excuses. It was showing me the truth, not the version I had constructed to suit my ego, but the raw, unfiltered reality of what my choices had done. I don't know how long it lasted. The presence didn't accuse or condemn, it simply revealed. But that was enough. By the end, I felt hollowed out, like every certainty I had ever clung to had been stripped away. When the presence finally pulled back, I was left trembling. I felt small, insignificant. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The answer came, not in words, but in a knowing that filled me to the core. To see, to choose. Suddenly, the light shifted again, and I was back in the waiting room. The figures had returned, but they weren't silent anymore. They hummed, not with words, but with a resonance that vibrated in my chest. It was a song, or maybe a prayer, and it wrapped around me like a warm embrace. One of the figures stepped forward, and I felt a jolt of recognition. It was my father. He looked younger than I remembered, his face unlined, his eyes bright with a joy I had never seen in life. He didn't speak, but his presence radiated love and forgiveness. I wanted to apologize, to tell him how sorry I was for pushing him away in his final years. But before I could, the scene around us changed again. We were standing in a field, a golden, endless expanse that stretched into the horizon. The air was alive with light and sound, and the ground beneath my feet felt warm and alive. My father stood beside me, his expression calm and steady. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, his voice clearer now, though it echoed with something greater than just him. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled. A glimpse. Nothing more. I looked around, trying to take it all in. The beauty of it was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the visual splendor, it was the feeling. This place wasn't just alive, it was life, pulsing and vibrant, connected in a way that defied comprehension. "You've spent your life looking for answers," my father said, his tone gentle but firm. "But you've never asked the right questions." I turned to him, tears streaming down my face. "What questions?" His smile widened, and for the first time, I saw the faintest glimmer of the light I had encountered earlier in his eyes. "You already know." Before I could respond, the field began to dissolve, the light fading into a deep, velvety darkness. My father's form shimmered, and I felt his presence slipping away. "Wait," I cried, reaching for him. "It's not too late, Margaret," he said, his voice fading. "But you must choose." And then, just like that, I was alone again. The waiting room was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. My life, as I had known it, was over. What came next would depend on the choice I hadn't yet made. When I came to, the world was blindingly bright and agonizingly loud. Every beep of a monitor, every rustle of paper, every clipped word spoken by the medical staff felt like an assault on my senses. My chest ached, each breath a struggle, and it took me a moment to piece together where I was. The sterile white walls, the faint smell of antiseptic. This was a hospital. I was alive. The realization hit me with a mixture of relief and dread. I had returned to the world I thought I understood, but nothing about it felt the same. My mind swirled with memories that felt too vivid, too real to dismiss as hallucinations. The presence, the waiting room, my mother's question, my father's words, they weren't dreams. They couldn't be. A nurse entered the room, her expression shifting to one of professional calm as she noticed I was awake. Dr. Fields, she said softly, her voice careful and measured, you gave us quite a scare. You were clinically dead for nearly 5 minutes. 5 minutes. 5 minutes in their world. But to me, it had felt like hours. Days even. The nurse busied herself checking my vitals, her words washing over me as I tried to ground myself. Cardiac arrest. Emergency CPR. Stabilized. But I barely heard her. My mind was elsewhere, replaying everything I had seen and felt in that other place. By the time the nurse left, I was alone with my thoughts. I stared at the ceiling, the stark white tiles glaring down at me. My body was here, tethered to machines that measured its fragility, but my spirit, or whatever part of me had experienced that, was still reeling. As the hours passed, visitors came and went. Colleagues stopped by briefly, offering well meaning but detached words of support. My department had dropped off a bouquet of flowers, more out of obligation than genuine care. None of them lingered. I couldn't blame them. I wasn't exactly known for my warmth or approachability. And then, late in the evening, my sister arrived. It had been years since I'd seen her. The last time we'd spoken, it had been an argument over faith, one of many. She'd called me arrogant, and I'd accused her of being gullible, of clinging to beliefs that offered false comfort. We hadn't spoken since. Yet here she was, standing awkwardly at the foot of my hospital bed, a hesitant smile on her face. Margaret, she said softly, I heard what happened. I'm glad you're okay. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss her, to fall back on the familiar armor of detachment and pride. But something in her eyes stopped me. She looked worried, not just for my health, but for something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. Thank you, I said finally, my voice hoarse. She sat down in the chair beside my bed, her movements tentative. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. You scared me, she said at last. When I got the call, I didn't know if I'd even make it here in time. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond. I've been praying for you, she added, her tone cautious. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but this time I didn't scoff or roll my eyes. Instead, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite identify, shame, maybe, or regret. Why? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Why would you pray for me after everything I've said to you? After the way I've treated you? She looked at me, her expression soft but firm. Because I love you, Margaret. And because I believe that no one is beyond grace, not even you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I had dismissed her faith as naive, her forgiveness as weakness. But now, after everything I had experienced, I wasn't so sure. We didn't talk much more that night. She stayed until visiting hours ended, sitting quietly beside me as I drifted in and out of sleep. When she left, she squeezed my hand gently, a gesture that felt foreign and comforting all at once. The next few days were a blur of medical tests and physical therapy, but the real battle was happening inside me. I couldn't shake the images and feelings from the waiting room, the presence that had stripped me bare and forced me to confront my life. I kept replaying my father's words. You've spent your life looking for answers, but you've never asked the right questions. What did that even mean? What questions had I failed to ask? One night, unable to sleep, I found myself staring out the window of my hospital room. The city lights stretched out before me, a glittering expanse of life and energy. I thought about all the people out there, each living their own lives, each making choices that rippled outward in ways they might never see. Had my choices mattered? Had I done anything with my life that truly made a difference? I wanted to believe that my work had value, that the lectures I gave and the research I conducted had advanced humanity's understanding of the universe. But the presence had shown me another side to my life, the harm I had caused, the people I had dismissed or hurt in my pursuit of truth. For the first time, I wasn't sure if my accomplishments were enough. The next morning, I asked for my laptop. The doctors warned me against overexerting myself, but I needed to do something to find some kind of clarity. I started researching near death experiences, diving into academic papers and personal accounts. The stories were eerily similar to my own. People from all walks of life described encounters with a divine presence, a light, a sense of overwhelming love and interconnectedness. They spoke of being shown their lives in excruciating detail, of being given a chance to change. It wasn't science that troubled me, it was how little science could explain. The data pointed to oxygen deprivation, neurotransmitter surges, and other physiological phenomena, but none of that explained the clarity, the vividness, the knowing. I felt a growing unease as I read account after account. The stories weren't just similar, they were connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite see. And at the center of it all was the same question that had haunted me since the waiting room. What have you done with the life you were given? I closed the laptop and sat back, my chest tight. I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go back to the person I was before. The question was, what would I do now? The day they discharged me from the hospital, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. Nothing had changed, of course. The sky was still a washed out gray, cars still humped impatiently on the streets below, and people shuffled along the sidewalks, their heads buried in their phones. But everything felt sharper, heavier. It was as though the experience I'd had peeled back a layer of reality, leaving me raw and exposed to things I'd never noticed before. My sister insisted on driving me home, even though I tried to wave her off. It was a quiet ride, awkward but not tense, with the hum of the radio filling the silences. She didn't push me to talk about what happened, though I could tell she wanted to. I wasn't ready. I couldn't even begin to explain it to myself, let alone someone else. When we reached my apartment, she helped me to the door and lingered in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the doorknob. Margaret, she said softly, if you ever want to talk about it, anything at all, I'm here. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Thanks, I managed, though the word felt woefully inadequate. The door closed behind me, and I was alone again. For the first time since the hospital, the weight of everything settled fully onto my shoulders. The apartment was as I'd left it, immaculate, sterile, the kind of place that looked like no one really lived there. It felt hollow, a reflection of the life I'd built. I sank into the couch and stared at the bookshelf across the room, packed with volumes on quantum physics, cosmology, and human psychology. The things I'd once considered the cornerstones of my identity. Now they felt like relics from a life I wasn't sure I wanted to return to. For the next few days, I tried to distract myself by throwing myself into work. My inbox was overflowing with emails from colleagues and students, mostly well wishes and inquiries about when I returned to teaching. I replied to the most pressing ones, deflecting questions about my health with vague assurances that I was recovering. But every time I tried to focus, my thoughts drifted back to the waiting room, to the presence that had peeled back the layers of my life and forced me to see what I'd been avoiding. The dreams didn't help. Every night, I relived fragments of what I'd seen: my mother's gaze, my father's words, the golden field that stretched into eternity. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my chest heaving, as though I'd been running from something I couldn't name. One evening, after yet another restless night, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. If I was going to make sense of what happened, I needed to confront it head on. I needed to understand what it all meant, not just the experience itself, but what it was asking of me. I started small. I reached out to a former student, one I hadn't thought about in years. He had dropped out after a particularly brutal critique I'd given during office hours. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. He wasn't cut out for academia, I'd told myself. But now I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too quick to dismiss him. Finding his contact information wasn't easy, but eventually, I tracked him down through a mutual colleague. I sent a tentative email, apologizing for the abruptness of my message and asking if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. To my surprise, he agreed. We met at a small cafe near the university. He looked older, more confident than I remembered, but there was still a hint of hesitance in his demeanor. We exchanged polite pleasantries before I finally worked up the courage to broach the subject. I've been thinking a lot about the time you spent in my class, I said, choosing my words carefully. I know I was direct in my feedback, and I'm worried that I may have been unfair to you. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a small, genuine smile that took me by surprise. You were harsh, he admitted, but you weren't wrong. At the time, I was devastated, but looking back, I needed that wake up call. It pushed me to reevaluate what I really wanted. And what was that? I asked, my curiosity piqued. Not academia, he said with a chuckle. I realized I wasn't passionate about research. I just liked the idea of it. I ended up going into nonprofit work, helping underprivileged kids get access to education. It's not glamorous, but it's fulfilling. His words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I'd viewed interactions like ours as transactional, moments where I dispensed knowledge or critique without much thought to the ripple effects. But here was proof that even my sharpest words could lead to something meaningful. It was humbling and unsettling. As we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The experience had planted a seed, a nagging question that refused to be ignored. What if I'd spent my life looking at things through the wrong lens? What if the measures of success I'd clung to, papers published, lectures given, awards won, weren't the ones that truly mattered? In the weeks that followed, I continued to reach out to people from my past, both students and colleagues. Some conversations were affirming, like the one with the former student, but others were harder. I learned about the ways my words had cut deeper than I realized, about the damage my arrogance had caused. It wasn't easy to hear, but it felt necessary. Each conversation chipped away at the walls I'd built around myself, forcing me to confront the truths I'd spent years avoiding. But the real breakthrough came one quiet afternoon as I sat alone in my apartment, staring at a blank notebook. I'd been trying to journal, to organize my thoughts and make sense of everything, but the words wouldn't come. Frustrated, I closed my eyes and let my mind wander. Images from the waiting room floated to the surface. My mother's question, my father's smile, the golden field. And then, like a whisper in the back of my mind, I heard the presence's words again. To see, to choose. In that moment, I realized what I needed to do. I couldn't rewrite the past, but I could choose a different path moving forward. The waiting room hadn't been a condemnation, it had been an invitation. A chance to see the interconnectedness I'd ignored and to live in a way that honored it. I didn't know what that would look like yet, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. The question that haunted me, what have you done with the life you were given, kept tugging at the edges of my mind, a relentless whisper I couldn't escape. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something deeper, a quiet but persistent invitation to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about myself, about the world, and about the threads that connected us all. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. The first step was admitting that I didn't have the answers. That was harder than I expected. My entire career had been built on certainty, on presenting facts and dismantling myths with clinical precision. But now, for the first time, I felt like I was the one standing on shaky ground. I wasn't used to asking questions without knowing the outcome, and I wasn't sure I liked it. I started with what I did know. Science was still my anchor, but I approached it differently, with a humility that felt foreign and uncomfortable. I began to re-examine studies on near-death experiences, diving deeper into the ones I'd once dismissed. The accounts I read weren't just anomalies to be explained away. They were testimonies of something profound, something that couldn't be fully captured by neurotransmitters and oxygen deprivation. People spoke of light, of presence, of a love so encompassing it defied language. It mirrored my own experience in ways that sent chills down my spine. But the more I read, the more I realized that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Understanding what had happened to me wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a call to action. If the waiting room had shown me anything, it was that my life had been a series of choices, and those choices had ripple effects I'd barely considered. If I was going to change, I needed to start making different choices. I decided to reach out to people I'd heard in the past, not out of guilt, but out of a genuine desire to understand the impact of my actions. The first person I contacted was a former colleague, Dr. Patel, who had left our department years ago after a particularly contentious faculty meeting. I'd always seen him as a rival, someone whose ideas clashed with mine, and I hadn't hesitated to tear into his research in front of the entire staff. At the time, it had felt like a victory. Now, it felt like something else entirely. When we met for coffee, he seemed surprised to see me, and I couldn't blame him. I wasn't sure how to start, so I just said the truth. "I owe you an apology," I began, my hands wrapped tightly around my coffee cup. "I was wrong to dismiss your work the way I did. I let my ego get in the way, and I didn't consider how it might affect you." Dr. Patel studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "That meeting, it made me question everything. I almost left academia entirely." His words stung, but he wasn't angry. If anything, he seemed more curious than resentful. "Why now?" he asked. "Why apologize after all these years?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Let's just say I've been doing a lot of reflection," I said carefully. "And I've realized that I need to take responsibility for the ways I've hurt people." He nodded again, and to my surprise, he smiled. "It means a lot to hear that," he said. "I've moved on, but it's good to know that you're willing to own up to it. Not everyone does." As we parted ways, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't absolution, I wasn't looking for that, but it was a step in the right direction. And it wasn't just about him. It was about me, about learning to see people not as obstacles or tools, but as individuals with their own struggles and stories. Over the next few weeks, I continued reaching out one person at a time. Some conversations were easier than others. A few people refused to meet with me, and I didn't blame them. Not everyone was ready to forgive, and that was their right. But for those who did, the process was humbling. Each interaction forced me to confront parts of myself I'd tried to ignore: my arrogance, my impatience, my tendency to value being right over being kind. At the same time, I began to notice small changes in how I approached my work. When I returned to teaching, I found myself listening more and lecturing less. Instead of dismissing students who struggled, I tried to meet them where they were, to understand their perspectives and guide them without judgment. It wasn't always easy, and I still slipped up more often than I liked, but I was trying. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually connecting with my students, not just teaching them. One day, after a particularly challenging seminar, a student lingered behind as the others filed out. She was quiet and nervous, twisting her hands as she approached me. "Dr. Fields," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you. The way you explained things today, it really helped me understand. I was struggling, but now I feel like I can actually do this." Her words caught me off guard. I wasn't used to hearing that kind of feedback, and it took me a moment to respond. "Thank you," I said finally. "I'm glad it helped." As she left, I sat at my desk, staring at the empty classroom. It was such a small thing, just a few words of gratitude, but it stayed with me. For so long, I measured my success by accolades and accomplishments, by the impact of my research on the scientific community. But now, I was starting to see that the real measure of my life wasn't in the grand gestures. It was in the small moments, the connections I made, the ways I chose to show up for others. That night, I sat down with my journal and began to write, not about the waiting room or the presents or even the question that haunted me. Instead, I wrote about the student, about the quiet joy I'd felt in knowing I'd made a difference, even if only for one person. It wasn't much, but it felt like a beginning. And for the first time since my near death experience, I allowed myself to hope that I was finally on the right path. It took months before I felt ready to speak about what happened to me, and even then, it wasn't easy. I had spent so much of my life building a persona rooted in certainty, a voice of reason in a chaotic world. Admitting that my perspective had shifted, that I had seen something beyond the boundaries of logic and science, felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was solid ground beneath me. The first time I shared my story publicly was at a small seminar organized by a colleague. It wasn't the kind of audience I was used to, mostly graduate students and a handful of professors from various disciplines, none of them as hostile or combative as the crowds I'd faced in the past. I could feel their curiosity, their tentative hope that I might offer them something new. I began with the facts: the collapse during my lecture, the cardiac arrest, the 5 minutes I was clinically dead. That part was easy. But as I transitioned into the experience itself, my throat tightened. I could almost feel the weight of the presence again, that overwhelming sense of being known completely, flaws and all. I paused, unsure if I could continue. I know what you're thinking, I said, forcing a small, nervous smile. 5 minutes without oxygen is more than enough time for the brain to conjure up hallucinations. That's what I would have said, too. But this wasn't like anything I've studied or read about. It wasn't a dream or a trick of the mind. It was real, more real than anything I've ever experienced. The room was silent, the air thick with the weight of my words. I pushed forward, describing the waiting room, the kaleidoscopic light, my mother and father. I told them about the question that had haunted me since. What have you done with the life you were given? And how it had forced me to confront the ways I had fallen short. As I spoke, I could see their faces shift, their expressions softening from skepticism to something else. Empathy, maybe, or recognition. When I finished, the room erupted in questions. Some were thoughtful, others skeptical, but none of them were dismissive. For the first time, I felt like I was having a conversation, not a debate. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to say, I don't know. The experience of sharing my story was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. It opened the door to more conversations, more opportunities to connect with people from all walks of life. Students, colleagues, strangers. They came to me with their own stories, their own questions about faith, purpose, and the mysteries of existence. I didn't have answers for them, but I listened. And in listening, I learned. One of the most surprising outcomes of this journey was my relationship with my sister. We had spent years at odds, our conversations often devolving into arguments about faith and reason. But now, for the first time, I could see where she was coming from. Her belief wasn't weakness, it was strength, a way of navigating the world with grace and humility. And while I still didn't share her faith in the traditional sense, I found myself drawn to the values it represented: compassion, forgiveness, interconnectedness. One evening, over tea in her cozy living room, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. Do you think the presence you felt was God? I hesitated, turning the question over in my mind. I don't know, I admitted. It didn't feel like the God I was taught about in Sunday school. It wasn't human, but it was something vast, something all encompassing. If that's what you call God, then maybe. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think what matters is what you do with it. Whether you call it God or love or the universe, it gave you a second chance. That's not something everyone gets. Her words stayed with me. A second chance. That's what it had been, hadn't it? A chance to choose differently, to live differently. And I wasn't going to waste it. I began writing a book, not the kind of academic text I was known for, but a memoir of sorts. It wasn't easy to put the experience into words, especially when so much of it defied explanation, but I felt compelled to try. I wanted to share what I'd seen, what I'd learned, not to convince anyone of its truth, but to offer them the same question that had been offered to me. What have you done with the life you were given? The writing process was slow and often painful. Revisiting the memories forced me to confront parts of myself I still wasn't proud of, but it was also healing. With every chapter, I felt like I was peeling back another layer, getting closer to the person I wanted to be. When the book was finally published, the response was overwhelming. I received letters and emails from people around the world, sharing their own stories of near death experiences, of loss and redemption, of moments when their lives had been irrevocably changed. I read every single one, often with tears in my eyes. It was humbling to realize how many people were searching for meaning, just as I had been. But the most profound moment came during a lecture at a small university. After I finished speaking, a young woman approached me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Your story, it helped me understand something I've been struggling with for years. I lost my mom recently, and I've been so angry, so afraid that she's just gone. But what you said, it gives me hope that she's still out there somewhere. I didn't know what to say. Her words pierced straight through me, and for a moment, all I could do was take her hand and squeeze it gently. I don't have all the answers, I told her, my voice barely above a whisper. But I believe she's not gone. I believe she's still connected to you, just like we're all connected. As I watched her walk away, a sense of peace settled over me. The waiting room, the presence, the question, it had all led me here, to this moment. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to face it. I stepped outside into the evening air, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. The light reminded me of the field I'd seen, the one my father had shown me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. I was alive. And for the first time, I understood what that truly meant.